I've never been the kind of man to believe in the supernatural. Growing up, I was raised in a practical household. We didn't tell ghost stories or discuss things that couldn't be explained by reason. But something happened years ago, something that still unsettles me to this day. Even now, I hesitate to share it because it sounds absurd, like the ramblings of someone trying to make sense of an impossible situation. But it happened, and the more I think about it, the more I realize that some truths are far darker than any ghost story. It was the summer of 1998, the year everything changed. I was living in a quiet town back then, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. I'd been away for years working in the city, chasing a career, but after some personal setbacks, I decided to return home for a while. My younger brother Alan and his wife Sarah still lived in the family house, the one we grew up in. They had a son, Luke, who was around 8 at the time. I didn't have kids of my own, and Alan had always been the more family-oriented one, so it was nice to be around them again after spending so long living a solitary life. Alan and I had always been close. We weren't just brothers, we were best friends growing up. But as the years passed and life took us in different directions, we lost some of that connection. Coming back to stay with them was my way of rebuilding those bridges, and for the first few months it felt like old times. I settled into a routine, helping Alan around the house, getting to know Luke better, and reconnecting with Sarah. Everything seemed normal, at least at first. One afternoon, Alan and I were sitting on the porch, watching Luke play in the yard. It was one of those lazy summer days where the heat clings to everything, making the world feel slow and distant. As we talked, a man walked by on the sidewalk. He was tall, with a lean frame and dark hair that looked a little too neat for someone just passing through town. Alan waved at him, and the man nodded in return, his face expressionless. I didn't think much of it then, but something about him bothered me. He wasn't from around here, that much was obvious. In a town this small, strangers didn't just pass by unnoticed. But when I asked Alan if he knew the man, he just shrugged. Probably just someone new in town, he said, brushing it off. Over the next few weeks, I saw the man more frequently. He'd be walking by in the evenings, or sitting at the corner of the park, watching the kids play. He never approached anyone, never spoke, but he was always there, like a shadow that lingered just out of sight. The unsettling part wasn't just his presence, but how no one else seemed to notice him. The neighbors didn't mention him, and when I brought it up to Alan, he would shrug it off again, saying I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, while I was out for a walk near the woods at the edge of town, I spotted the man again. He was standing at the entrance to the woods, staring into the trees. For a moment I considered approaching him, but something in his posture made me stop. His back was stiff, his head tilted slightly as though he was listening to something deep within the forest. Then, without warning, he stepped into the woods and disappeared from sight. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had vanished. The woods weren't the kind of place people went at night. There were too many stories about those woods, too many accidents, too many disappearances over the years. But the next morning he was back, walking along the street as though nothing had happened. From then on, I began to see him more and more. He'd appear at odd times, always watching, always quiet. It started to affect me, my sleep, my mood. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like something was wrong with me for even noticing him when no one else seemed to care. But then Luke mentioned him one night. He asked, in the innocent way kids do, why the man who doesn't smile was always near the playground. I felt a chill run down my spine. If Luke had noticed him, then I wasn't imagining things. I asked Alan about it again, but he still brushed it off, telling me not to worry. It wasn't until Sarah mentioned seeing the man one evening, standing across the street from their house, that Alan started to take me seriously. One night, everything came to a head. It was late, well after midnight, when I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. I got out of bed and peered through the curtains. There, in the dim light from the street lamp, was the man, standing in the driveway, staring directly at our house. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by the silence of the night. I shone the flashlight toward him, and for the first time he reacted. His head snapped toward me, and I saw his eyes cold, empty, like black pits that seemed to absorb all light. He didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. Then slowly he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I told Alan everything, my voice shaking as I recounted the night's events. I expected him to be concerned, but instead he was oddly calm, dismissing my fears as the product of an overactive imagination. His reaction bothered me. He wasn't acting like himself. Over the next few days, I noticed a change in him. He grew distant, his usual warmth replaced by a strange coldness. He spent more time away from the house, often disappearing into the woods without explanation. When I pressed him about it, he would get defensive, insisting that everything was fine. But I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, while Alan was out, I went into his room. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe some explanation, some clue as to what was happening. What I found instead made my blood run cold. Hidden in the back of his closet was a small box filled with photographs, old, faded photos of the man I had been seeing. Some were decades old, but the man hadn't aged a day. In each photo he stood in the background, always watching, always near children. I felt sick. How had Alan kept this from me? Why hadn't he said anything? I confronted him when he returned that evening, but he denied everything. His denial was too quick, too sharp, and I knew then that he was lying. I didn't know why or what was happening, but I was certain now that the man wasn't just a stranger. He was something else, something far more dangerous. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Alan barely spoke to me, and Sarah seemed oblivious to the growing distance between us all. I decided to leave, to get away from the madness before it consumed me. But the night before I was set to go, it happened. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were inside the house. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and crept down the hallway. As I reached the living room, I saw Alan standing by the front door. He was holding something in his hands, something small and silver, glinting in the dim light. His back was to me, but I could tell from the way he stood that something was horribly wrong. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw Luke's favorite toy, the one he always carried with him, lying on the floor by Alan's feet. And then I noticed the man standing just outside the door, watching, waiting. I froze, my mind racing. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The man wasn't the danger. Alan was. He had been for a long time. The man had been watching us, not out of malice, but to protect us from my own brother. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Alan had been spiraling, his behavior growing more erratic, more dangerous. The man had known, somehow. He had been watching, trying to stop something terrible from happening. But now it was too late. Alan turned slowly, his eyes wild, and I saw the knife in his hand. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could react, the front door burst open. The man, the one I had feared for so long, rushed in, grabbing Alan and pinning him to the ground. I stood there, frozen, as the man wrestled the knife from Alan's hand and held him down. By the time the police arrived, I was still in shock. They took Alan away, and I later found out that he had been struggling with severe mental illness for years, something he had kept hidden from all of us. The man, the stranger who had been watching us, disappeared that night. I never saw him again, but I'll never forget the role he played. The man had been a protector, not a predator. He'd been watching, waiting for the moment when he would need to step in, when my own brother would become the real threat. I was 21 when I encountered something that still lingers in the corners of my mind, unsettling me even in my quietest moments. It happened in the late 90s, a time when I believed the world was full of only explainable things. But one night, on a road I should never have taken, I learned that not everything fits neatly into logic. It was late November, nearing winter, and I was on my way back to my grandparents' house in a small coastal town. They lived in one of those remote places where the sea meets the hills, a place I had fond memories of from childhood but hadn't visited for years. Life had taken me elsewhere: work, college, the endless pursuit of things that seemed so important back then. But this time I was drawn back, maybe out of nostalgia, or perhaps because I missed the quiet of the countryside. I left Mumbai later than I planned. My car, which had already seen better days, decided to give me trouble along the way: a flat tire, followed by some more minor issues that delayed me by hours. By the time I was back on the road, it was already dusk. Driving through those winding roads of the countryside in the daytime was one thing, but night was an entirely different story. The darkness here felt thicker, like it was trying to swallow the road, the trees, the car, everything. There are 2 routes to get to my grandparents' place, and I chose the shorter one, a narrow, winding road that cuts through the remote hills and sleepy villages. It's the kind of route people use only if they're familiar with it. Locals knew that once night falls, it's best avoided, but I was young, tired, and eager to get home. So I pushed forward, even as the road became more isolated. There was something unsettling about how quiet it became. The sound of my tires crunching on the gravel was the only noise around. No streetlights, no other cars, just the silhouettes of trees against the starless sky. I was starting to question my choice of route when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, at the edge of the road, in the middle of nowhere, stood a young girl. She was waving one hand towards my car, not frantically, but with a slow, almost deliberate motion. I slowed the car, squinting to get a better look. Her figure seemed too still, too calm for someone standing alone on a deserted road so late at night. As I rolled closer, I could make out more details. She was young, probably no more than 16. Her clothes were simple: a plain dress and a light scarf draped around her shoulders, shielding her from the cool night air. There was something strange about how calm she appeared, but I convinced myself she must have been left behind or lost. The nearest village was miles away, and I couldn't just drive past her, leaving her there. I pulled over, stopping a few feet from where she stood. She approached the car without hesitation, her movements smooth, almost eerie in their grace. There wasn't an ounce of fear or urgency in her demeanor. As she reached the passenger side, she tapped gently on the window. Her face was soft, innocent even, though her eyes seemed old or tired, perhaps, but still unreadable. I rolled down the window, and before I could ask if she was okay, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something clear about it, something that demanded attention. She asked for a ride, saying she needed to get to a nearby village, one that happened to be on my route. She explained that she had missed the last bus and had no other way home. I hesitated. The road was desolate, the hour late, and I couldn't shake the unease I felt. But she looked harmless enough, and what was the worst that could happen? Maybe it was the loneliness of the drive or my own fatigue, but I found myself unlocking the door and letting her in. As she settled into the passenger seat, I could feel a strange tension in the air. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of discomfort I couldn't quite place. We began to drive, and for a while, neither of us said anything. The silence between us stretched out, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. After a few minutes, she introduced herself. Lena, that was her name. There was something distant in the way she spoke, as though she was used to holding back, used to being quiet. She told me she had been visiting her uncle in a nearby village and had stayed longer than expected, which was why she had missed the bus. The way she explained things, her voice steady and calm, almost made me forget the strangeness of it all. We talked about small things, insignificant things, her school, her uncle's illness, and how she had to be home early for some responsibilities the next day. I found myself listening more than speaking, her soft voice oddly soothing, though every now and then a twinge of unease would creep back in. Something about her was just off. But I pushed the thought aside. Maybe it was just the isolation of the road, the lateness of the hour playing tricks on my mind. The drive went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than that. As we neared a stretch of road that ran along the coast, she finally spoke again, asking me to pull over. "This is where I need to go," she said. I looked around, confused. There was nothing here, just the dark outline of the sea on one side and a shadowy hill on the other. "Are you sure?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of a house or a path leading somewhere. She nodded, pointing toward the hill, saying her house was just beyond it. I offered to walk with her, but she shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No further," she said quietly, her voice firm but still soft. I didn't press her. Something about the way she looked at me, the finality in her eyes, made me drop the subject. She opened the door, stepped out, and without looking back, disappeared into the darkness beyond the road. I stayed there for a few moments, watching the spot where she had vanished. My unease was growing, a knot forming in my stomach. But what could I do? I had no reason to doubt her. Yet, as I drove away, the silence in the car felt heavier, almost suffocating. The empty seat beside me felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened, something that wasn't supposed to happen. When I finally reached my grandparents' house, it was past midnight. My grandmother was still awake, waiting for me. She looked relieved to see me, but surprised at how late I had arrived. After some tea and a bit of conversation, I mentioned the girl I had given a ride to. As soon as I brought it up, the mood in the room shifted. My grandfather, who had been quietly sitting in the corner, set down his cup and looked at me, his expression serious. "You shouldn't have stopped there," he said quietly. His voice had a weight to it that I hadn't heard before, a seriousness that made my skin crawl. I asked him what he meant, and he explained, with a slow, deliberate tone, that the area where I had picked up the girl had a reputation. People around there spoke of strange things happening on that stretch of road, encounters with figures, people who appeared out of nowhere at night and then vanished without a trace. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. But as the night wore on, the weight of his words began to settle into my mind. I tried to brush it aside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The image of the girl, her calm demeanor, her quiet voice, it all felt too strange, too unnatural. The next day, I decided to go back and retrace my steps. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to find out more. I drove to the same coastal road, the same place where I had dropped Lena off the night before. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when I got there, it was as empty and desolate as I had remembered. There was no house, no path leading up the hill, nothing but the cold wind coming off the sea. As I stood there, a man approached me from the nearby beach. He was a local farmer, maybe in his 50s. and he seemed surprised to see me there. I asked him if he knew of any homes nearby or if anyone had seen a girl walking around at night. His expression changed immediately, growing darker, more cautious. I had a daughter, he said slowly, but she's been gone for 10 years. A chill ran down my spine. I asked him about Lena, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He told me his daughter had died in a car accident on this very road, on a night much like the one I had just driven through. She had missed a bus, gotten a ride from a stranger, and the car had crashed, killing her instantly. The world seemed to tilt around me as I tried to process what he had just said. His words echoed in my mind, making it hard to focus. 10 years. How could it be 10 years? The girl I had picked up, Lena, she had been real. I had spoken to her, driven with her, watched her walk away. It couldn't have been a ghost, could it? Yet, as I stood there, looking into the farmer's tired eyes, I could see the grief still fresh on his face, even after a decade. There was no doubt that he believed what he was telling me. I asked him more questions, trying to piece things together, but he seemed uncomfortable with the conversation. After a few minutes, he excused himself, leaving me standing alone by the road, my mind swirling with disbelief. The day felt colder, the air heavier, as if the world around me was pressing in, challenging my understanding of reality. I drove back to my grandparents' house in a daze, my thoughts racing. I couldn't tell them what the farmer had told me, not yet, at least. Instead, I spent the rest of my time there in a kind of distracted haze. The memory of that night, of Lena's calm voice, her odd sense of peace, kept replaying in my mind. Every detail seemed sharper now, every word she had spoken carrying more weight. I left the village a few days later, returning to the busy rhythm of my life, but I couldn't shake what had happened. It stayed with me, like a shadow following me everywhere. Nights were the hardest whenever I found myself alone in the dark. My mind would drift back to that stretch of road, to the girl who had climbed into my car without fear. Months passed. Eventually, I pushed the memory of Lena to the back of my mind. Life got busy. Work became more demanding, and I found myself absorbed in the day-to-day grind. Yet every now and then, usually late at night when things were quiet, her face would appear in my thoughts. I would wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, or if there was more to it, something beyond the rational explanations I had tried to cling to. It was nearly a year after that night when I found myself driving back to my grandparents' house. They had organized a family reunion, and I couldn't avoid the trip. As I packed my bags and prepared for the journey, the memory of Lena crept back into my consciousness. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a growing unease as the date approached, a feeling that something was unfinished. I left the city late, just like the last time. By the time I reached the same stretch of road where I had picked Lena up, it was nearly midnight. My heart was pounding as I drove, my eyes scanning the road ahead, half expecting to see her again. And then, as if on cue, there she was, standing at the same spot, her figure illuminated by my headlights, her hand raised in that same slow, deliberate motion. I pulled over, my mind racing. This time I didn't feel the same hesitation. It was as if I had been expecting her, as if I knew this encounter was inevitable. She approached the car, her face just as calm as before. She opened the door without a word and slid into the passenger seat, the same gentle smile on her lips, the same peaceful air about her. We drove in silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. "You know who I am now, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. There was no use pretending I didn't know. The truth of her existence, or whatever she was, had become impossible to deny. She wasn't just a memory or a figment of my imagination. She was something else entirely. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her eyes studying me with quiet curiosity. Strangely, I wasn't. I had been once, but not anymore. There was something about her presence that, while deeply unsettling, didn't inspire fear. It was as though I had accepted the strangeness of the situation, resigned to the fact that some things couldn't be explained. "No," I said. "I'm not afraid." She nodded as if she had expected that answer. We drove on, the road winding through the hills, the sound of the sea in the distance. I had so many questions, but I didn't know where to start. It felt surreal. Here I was, driving with someone who had been dead for 10 years, someone who shouldn't even exist in this world anymore. I finally found the courage to ask her, "Why did you come back? Why did you find me?" For a moment, she was silent. Then she spoke, her voice even softer now, almost wistful. "Not everyone can see us," she said. "Not everyone is open to it. You were the first in a long time who could." I wasn't sure what she meant, but I didn't press her. There was a sadness in her voice now, something that made me hesitate to ask too much. It was as if she was carrying a burden that I couldn't fully understand, one that had kept her tethered to this world even after all these years. As we drove, I noticed something strange. The air inside the car felt heavier, thicker, as if the space around us was becoming denser. I could feel a shift, a change in the atmosphere, like we were moving between worlds. Lena seemed to sense it too. She asked me to stop the car as we neared the same spot where I had dropped her off all those years ago. Her face, which had been calm and peaceful, now carried a weight of finality. "I have to go," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine. "This is where I belong." I felt a strange sense of loss, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't want to let her go, not without understanding more, not without getting answers to the questions that had haunted me since that first night. But there was no arguing with her. I could see it in her face. The decision had already been made. Before she left, I asked her one final question. "Will I see you again?" She smiled, but there was sadness in that smile. "I don't know," she said softly. "Maybe, but not for a long time." With that, she stepped out of the car and walked into the darkness, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the hill, just like the first time. This time, though, I didn't feel the same unease. Instead, there was a strange sense of closure, as if something that had been left unresolved for years had finally come to an end. I waited there for a few minutes, staring at the spot where she had vanished, before driving away. The road felt different now, less ominous, as if the weight that had been pressing down on it for all those years had finally lifted. I returned to my grandparents' house, my mind calmer than it had been in a long time. In the years that followed, I never saw Lena again. The strange, quiet girl from the road remained a memory, one that faded slowly over time but never completely disappeared. I often wonder where she is now, if she found peace, if she moved on to wherever she was supposed to go. I don't have the answers to those questions, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain: that night changed me. It opened my eyes to a world beyond the one we know, a world where the lines between life and death, between reality and the unknown, aren't as clear as we think. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I can still hear her voice, soft and distant, reminding me that not all ghosts are meant to haunt. Some, like Lena, are just passing through, waiting for someone to see them, to listen, and to remember. I never thought of myself as a superstitious man. Life, as far as I was concerned, was a straightforward thing full of cause and effect, logic and reason. Ghost stories and urban legends were for kids, campfire tales that held no ground in the light of day. But then there was that summer, the summer when everything changed, and now, looking back, I wonder if there are some things we're not supposed to understand. It all started not long after my younger brother Eddie died. He'd been the kind of person who lit up a room, always joking, always moving. Losing him was like a light going out, and we all felt the chill. Left behind were his wife, Carla, and their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Carla took it the hardest, as you'd expect. They'd been high school sweethearts, glued to each other through thick and thin. But it was Lily I worried about the most. She was such a quiet, sweet kid, and when Eddie died, it was like she withdrew even further into herself. It didn't seem right to me, Carla having to bear the weight alone, so I decided to move closer, just for a while. I took a leave from work, rented a small place about 10 minutes from their house, and tried to make myself useful. Eddie had been my only sibling, and I felt it was my duty to be there for his family. I'd always felt close to Carla, too. She was like a sister to me and Lily. Well, she was one of the few kids I'd ever truly felt comfortable around. But after Eddie's passing, there was a distance there, an unease I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, it was just little things. Lily was shy to begin with, but now she seemed afraid, always clutching this battered old stuffed bear Eddie had given her. It was one of those toys with big button eyes and a lopsided smile, the kind you might pick up at a thrift shop. She'd had it for a while, but now it was like she couldn't let it go. Every time I saw her, she'd be holding it, talking to it, almost as if it were a real person. I remember the first time I noticed something was truly off. It was one of those early summer evenings, and the three of us were out in the backyard, trying to enjoy a quiet barbecue. Lily was off to the side, sitting on a swing Eddie had hung from a tree years ago, rocking back and forth, talking softly to her bear. I tried to engage her in conversation, but she was distant, distracted, her gaze fixed on something beyond the yard. Carla looked exhausted, barely picking at her food, her eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. She'd lost a lot of weight since Eddie died, and it worried me, but she was as stubborn as ever, insisting she was fine. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Carla and I sat out on the porch, sipping on a couple of beers. I asked her about Lily, about how she'd been handling things. Carla just shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. She told me Lily had been having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming, her little hands clutching that bear like it was a lifeline. She'd go in to comfort her, only to find Lily sitting up in bed, staring at the wall, whispering things Carla couldn't understand. She keeps saying she sees him, Carla said, her voice trembling. She says Eddie's still here, watching over us. I don't know if it's comforting or terrifying. I didn't know what to say. It's natural for kids to have vivid imaginations, especially after losing a parent. But there was something about the way Carla described it, something that sent a chill down my spine. I told her Lily would probably grow out of it, that it was just her way of coping. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The days that followed were a blur of strange occurrences. Lily became more withdrawn, barely speaking, always clinging to that bear. She'd sit in her room for hours, talking to it in a low, murmuring voice. Sometimes I'd catch snippets of what she was saying, and it didn't sound like a child's play. It sounded serious, almost like she was having a real conversation. One night as I was heading to bed, I heard Lily's voice drifting down the hallway. I stopped outside her door, listening. She was speaking softly, but there was something odd about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed the door open a crack and saw her sitting cross-legged on the floor, the bear in her lap, staring up at her with those button eyes. She didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in whatever she was saying, but then she looked up and her eyes met mine. There was something in her gaze that I can't quite explain, something cold, something that didn't belong. I asked her who she was talking to, but she just looked away, clutching the bear tighter. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but things only got worse. I started to feel a presence in the house, something dark and heavy, like a shadow that lurked just out of sight. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a whisper of cold air that seemed to follow me from room to room to room. But as the days passed, it became more pronounced. I'd hear footsteps at odd hours, the sound of someone breathing just behind me, only to turn and find nothing there. One afternoon, I went into Eddie's old study, hoping to find something to occupy my mind. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just browsing through his things, trying to feel close to him again. I found an old box of photos, mostly of him and Carla, some of Lily as a baby. But tucked away at the bottom of the box was something that caught my eye, a journal. Eddie had never been one for writing, so I was curious to see what he'd written about. As I flipped through the pages, my curiosity turned to unease. The entries were sparse, disjointed, but there was a pattern to them, a thread of fear that ran through each one. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, feeling a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He mentioned the bear, how he'd found it at a flea market, something about how it had called to him. The more I read, the more I realized that Eddie had been experiencing the same things I was now. He'd felt the presence too, the darkness that seemed to hang over the house like a storm cloud. One entry in particular sent a chill down my spine. He'd written about a night not long before his death, when he'd woken up to find Lily standing at the foot of his bed, clutching the bear, her eyes wide and vacant. He said she'd been talking to someone, whispering things he couldn't understand. When he asked her what she was doing, she told him that he was here, that he was watching. Eddie had tried to get rid of the bear after that, but every time he threw it away, it would somehow find its way back into the house. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to believe it was all just a coincidence, the product of a grieving mind searching for answers. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with that bear, something that went beyond the realm of logic and reason. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, my mind racing with thoughts of Eddie, of Lily, of the shadow that seemed to be closing in on us. Around midnight, I heard a noise coming from Lily's room, a low, murmuring sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I got up and made my way down the hall, pausing outside her door. I pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting on the floor with the bear in her lap, her eyes closed, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I watched her for a moment, trying to decide what to do. But then she opened her eyes, and the look she gave me was one of pure malice, a look that didn't belong on the face of a 7-year-old child. She stood up, still clutching the bear, and walked past me without a word, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I felt a surge of panic, a primal fear that I hadn't felt since I was a child. I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, every room, every corner, but she was gone. I woke Carla, frantic, and together we scoured the neighborhood, calling her name, searching for any sign of her, but there was nothing. We finally found her the next morning, sitting on the swing in the backyard, the bear cradled in her arms. She looked up at us with a vacant expression, as if she didn't recognize us, as if we were strangers. Carla rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face, but I just stood there, staring at the bear, as though it held all the answers to the nightmare we were living. Lily didn't say a word. She just sat there, clutching that bear with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. I had the sudden urge to grab it from her, to tear it apart and rid us of whatever curse it carried. But something in me held back, a voice whispering that it wouldn't make a difference. Carla took Lily inside, and I stood there in the yard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was watching me, those button eyes glinting in the early morning light. It was absurd, but I felt its gaze, cold and unfeeling, boring into me. And in that moment I knew that whatever had taken hold of Lily wasn't going to let go easily. Days passed, and the tension in the house grew unbearable. Lily's strange behavior continued, and Carla seemed to grow more withdrawn with each passing day. She barely spoke, her movements mechanical, as if she were sleepwalking through her own life. I tried to bring up the bear, to tell her about Eddie's journal, but every time I mentioned it, she'd brush me off, saying I was overreacting, that Lily was just grieving in her own way. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I got up, my heart racing, and opened the door. There, standing at the end of the hall, was Lily. She was holding the bear, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at something I couldn't see. I called her name, but she didn't respond. She just turned and walked into Carla's room, disappearing into the darkness. I followed, my feet moving of their own accord, driven by a need to protect, to understand. I reached Carla's room and pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. Carla was lying on the bed, her face pale and drawn, her eyes closed. Lily stood beside her, the bear clutched to her chest, her lips moving in that strange, silent prayer. I stepped into the room, and as I did, Lily looked up at me, her eyes filled with a darkness I'd never seen before. She smiled, a cold, eerie smile that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she spoke. "It's time." I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The voice that came from her lips was deep, gravelly, nothing like the sweet, innocent voice of a child. I felt a chill wash over me, a sense of dread that seemed to seep into my bones. "What? What do you mean?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. Lily's smile widened and she took a step toward me, the bear still clutched to her chest. "He's coming," she said, her voice filled with a cold, unfeeling certainty. "He's been waiting for so long, and now he's finally ready." I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to help her. I glanced at Carla, still lying on the bed, oblivious to the horror unfolding around her. And then, in a moment of desperation, I reached out and grabbed the bear from Lily's hands, tearing it from her grip. As soon as I touched it, a wave of nausea washed over me, and I felt a coldness seep into my skin, as if the bear itself were alive, pulsing with some dark, malevolent energy. I stumbled back, the bear slipping from my fingers and falling to the floor. Lily screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that seemed to echo through the room, filling the air with a palpable sense of terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped. Lily collapsed to the floor, her body limp, her eyes closed. I rushed to her side, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. She was breathing, thank God, but she was unconscious, her face pale and drawn, as if she'd been drained of all her energy. I looked over at Carla, but she was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had just happened. I picked Lily up and carried her back to her room, laying her gently on the bed. She looked so small, so fragile, lying there with her eyes closed, her face peaceful in sleep. I sat beside her, watching her breathe, my mind racing with questions, with fears I couldn't quite put into words. The next morning, Lily woke up with no memory of what had happened. She was quiet, subdued, but there was no trace of the darkness that had consumed her the night before. Carla was the same, her mood lightening as the day wore on, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I didn't mention the bear, didn't tell them about the voice, the scream, the darkness that had filled the room. I didn't want to scare them, didn't want to burden them with the horror I'd witnessed. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, something dark and malevolent, waiting for the right moment to strike. I threw the bear away, buried it deep in the woods where no one would find it, hoping to rid ourselves of the curse that had taken hold of our lives. But even now, months later, I still feel its presence, a coldness that lingers in the air, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. I don't know if we'll ever truly be free, if we'll ever escape the darkness that claimed Eddie, that threatened to consume us all. But I hold on to hope, clinging to the light, praying that one day we'll find peace. Until then, I'll keep watching, keep waiting, keep fighting against the shadows that haunt us, that linger just out of sight. Because I know deep down that they're still there, waiting for the right moment to strike, to drag us back into the darkness from which we may never escape.